Good morning and welcome to the November edition of the Northwest Collaborative Masterclass. I'm Kevan Collier, the Strategic Lead at Northwest Employers. I'm responsible for Learning and OD. The Collaborative is brought to you by 5 partners across the Northwest. It's made up of Aqua, MIAA, Northwest Employers, Northwest ADAS, and the Northwest NHS Leadership Academy. And together we can bring our shared knowledges and resources together in order to make sure that we bring the best possible speakers to you, our members, and also support that knowledge exchange across the sector. Just some domestics first of all. The session will be recorded, so just so that you're aware of that. We will also have an interactive session, so there will be a number of breakout sessions throughout this morning. Please can we ensure that mics are on mute as we go through, and also there is a chat function, so please feel free to use that if you want to introduce yourself or you have any questions as we go through this morning's session. Today's session is how can we use better evidence-based approaches to support the public sector in meeting its challenges. During today's session, we'll very much be looking at how we, what evidence-based practice is, how we can ensure the best possible evidence-based approach within our organisation, what are the forms of evidence that we can use, and how can we ensure that we are learning from local case studies to understand the benefits of applying an evidence-based practice within our sessions. So today's presenter will be Rob Briner. Rob is a Professor of Organisational Psychology at Queen's Mary University, London, and is the Director of Research at the Corporate Research Forum. He is also currently Visiting Professor of Evidence-Based HRM at Birkbeck University, London, and a Visiting Professor at Oslo Nye Sola. Previously, he was the co-founder and scientific director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management and has held positions at universities such as Sheffield, Birkbeck University of London, the Institute of Employment Studies, London School of Economics, King's College London, and the University of Bath. His research has focused on several topics, including well-being, emotions, stress, ethnicity, the psychological contract, organisational culture, climate, absence from work, motivation, work, non-work, and everyday working behaviour. Beyond his academic research and teaching, Rob helps practitioners and organisations in several ways by making better use of evidence, looking at how academics can make academic research more accessible. He has written and presented for many organisations on HR management, organisational psychology, and is involved in various activities aimed at developing and promoting an evidence-based practice in organisational psychology and HR management. He has received several awards in his career. These include the British Psychological Society Division of Occupational Psychology Academic Contribution to Practitioners Award in 2014 and topped the HR magazine's Most Influential Thinking list in 2016, and in 2019 received a Lifetime Achievement Award and was admitted to the HR magazine's Hall of Fame. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Rob, who will take us through the rest of our session. Thank you.
These issues, but also you'll have some sense of how can I start to use this in my own work. I'm going to emphasize throughout this, evidence-based practice does not mean making perfect decisions. It means making better informed decisions. So one of the major barriers to evidence-based practice is sometimes people think, well, I can't get hold of the data, I don't understand the data, I can't get hold of the evidence, I haven't got time, so I won't even bother. And one strong message I'm trying to get over today is even if you do it a bit, you're more likely to help your clients and do things that are effective. So it's not about perfection, it's about making better use of data and evidence. Okay, so let's start with trying to understand the origins and history of evidence-based practice. So what we're going to start doing is you're going to be put into breakout rooms for 15 minutes. And I want you to think about these questions. Now, if you go into breakout rooms, I think you won't be able to see the slides anymore. So can I just suggest you just take a picture on your camera of these questions in this slide so you know what to do once you go into your breakout rooms. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is, what does evidence-based practice mean to you? As I say, unless you've never heard of it, most people have heard of it or they've got some sense of what it means. So just discuss what it means to you for about 5 minutes. Don't think about your own professional life and answer the question to what extent you think you do things in an evidence-based way, and try and give yourself a little score. So 0 is I'm never evidence-based, which I guess no one's going to say. 10 is like the most I could be evidence-based, which again, probably not many people are going to say, but think where along that continuum, given your current understanding of evidence-based practice, what it means, think where you are in your own professional life. Then the next question is, think about in general. So not necessarily at work, think about what we mean by a well-informed decision. It could be a decision in your personal life. It could be something to do with an activity you're doing with your family. It could be something about your career. It could be a decision about lots of things, buying something. But what is a well-informed decision? So think about how do you know the decision was well-informed? What does that mean to be well-informed? Would you expect to see a kind of process being followed if you were going to make an informed decision? And how would a well-informed decision use evidence and data? So how would it use evidence and data to become a well-informed decision? And then just ask someone to maybe take notes so we can give some group plenary feedback after that. So if that's okay, I think Christina's going to put you into breakout rooms and I will see you back here in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for taking part in that activity. Just an opportunity now, if there are any questions for Rob following those discussions, or if there's any feedback from the breakout rooms that you'd like to share with the wider group this morning.
You want me to share some of our feedback?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah?
Zoe, thank you.
Making a few notes as we went through. So we talked about getting the balance between reviewing the evidence base, but also looking at co-production and acknowledging that the evidence base might be weak, or we might need to consider the context that we're working in as well. We talked about evidence-based practice can be resource intensive, and sometimes that limits how much we can review the evidence base. So it's important to sort of bring in colleagues or ask for support where possible to sort of help us with that. We talked about, so we looked at it from a sort of commissioning services lens, and then colleagues from adult social care looked at it in terms of making individual decisions about an individual. And we were talking about how that's very subjective and it's important to have trust as part of that process. Yeah, I think they were our main points. If anyone else wants to jump in, please do.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Zoe. Any other feedback on top of Zoe's?
Jackie's got a hand up, Kevan.
Hi, Vicky. Sorry, I can't see hands. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, well, and then Jackie after Vicky. Sorry, Vicky.
Okay. What we talked about was it's different in nursing to if in social care. So in like nursing, you've got a lot of research, standard operating procedures, or like where there is no research, there's like a consensus decision when you're making decisions, and a lot of that is standardized in whereas in adult social care it's different because these sort of like the evidence sources are different. So sort of like you're getting different sources for different projects depending on what evidence it is that you need. And there's a critical appraisal element to any of the evidence that you're getting. You sort of like benchmarking what's happening in other areas, because you're finding out what's going on. In sort of like public health, there's like community in the community outreach, they're evidence based around delivering the vaccine, and like there's an evidence insight unit which provides the relevant evidence you need around the projects and things like that. But when it comes to personalised care, you've got to, and sort of like making informed decisions, you're using multiple sources, you're checking whether they're credible or valid. You sort of like, you also use your intuition, but there's usually literature to back up what you're saying. But you can't be emotional. You've got to, whatever you're saying, you're backing up what you're saying. And sometimes there aren't evidence sources there. And sometimes in social care, if you don't have the funding to do something, even though there might be the evidence there, things can't happen. I think that was an overview of it all.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vicky. And as I say, apologies, I can't see if anybody else has got their hand
Just
up or if there's
Jackie.
a
I don't know
queue.
if you want to bring
So,
Jackie in, Kevan.
yeah, Jackie, if you want to feedback, please.
Yeah, just similar to other rooms, really. I mean, I'm from adult social care, so we use evidence-based practice in the sense of making well-informed decisions about people that we're working with, and recognizing that information can come from all sorts of places, and that it's gathered from all in terms of research, in terms of case law. We did recognize that there is some differences between health and social care, in the sense of the in social care there's quite a lot of challenges, and we use a lot of our evidence base, because we're also working potentially in maybe a person-centered way, as a bias, that we take a lot from the person with lived experience and those people who are supporting them around. And the challenge is to actually take the time to also look at research and case law in those instances. Talked about the intuitive element of that can come into play when you're gathering evidence. And we also, I talked a bit about personally, the differences sometimes, in the sense of how much that intuition plays a part. For instance, if when you're buying a house, then how many times you go into somewhere and it feels great, and you're sort of like, then you're not necessarily doing a full, some people might, but we're not. You're not necessarily doing then a full research about the area and the history of the house and everything else. And then there was an example of I think it was Lisa, who looks at the reviews on Amazon before she buys something, and I don't. So there was very much highlighted an individual element too, in personally, but also that could probably may play out professionally as well, about how you actually evidence-based practice, how you actually do evidence-based practice, in terms of how in depth you do you complete your research and you gather your evidence to make a decision or not. And certainly I'm not one that looks at reviews. That was highlighted on Amazon. I just get sparkled by low prices and bog offs. But Lisa does a bit more research before she makes a purchase, which is very sensible. But it just was interesting to see that, to me, that difference and how that played out. So that was it really. I think it was just, we did do some comparisons, and I think in terms of contracts and commissioning, there's not necessarily a static blueprint of how we gather evidence, a tick box, but different areas do it in different ways according to what they, and a more, so it's recognizing that there are different ways to do it, and not necessarily a static blueprint.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jackie, for that feedback, and obviously for other colleagues for feeding back. Give us a really good start around the discussion within this area. So if there isn't any other feedback from any of the other groups, I'll hand back over to Rob, and he can start to respond to some of what we've discussed already and take us through the rest of the presentation. So back over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you all for those very, very insightful comments. And in fact, they touch on quite a lot of the stuff we're going to do over the rest of the course of the session. The first thing is, I guess, this difference between different professions. So evidence-based practice, I think, is exactly the same principles, and I'm going to emphasize that, but the way it plays out in different contexts is very different, partly because of the nature of the evidence you've got, partly because of the training, and partly because of the history of those professions and the funding of those professions and the politics of those professions. So it definitely plays out a bit differently. That's important. I think also you started to draw distinctions between evidence-based practice, meaning what do I, as an individual practitioner or clinician, do with a person, a family that is in front of me? How do I do evidence-based practice there? Versus, for example, how do I do evidence-based practice when it comes to commissioning? And I'm going to add another layer, which may be discussed in your groups or not, is how do you do evidence-based management of organizations in which you all work? So there's at least those 3 different levels of things. So something I'm going to talk about later is, I think if you talk about, say, evidence-based policing, as another example that I've been involved with, I think if you want to do evidence-based policing, if you want police officers, the police service to be evidence-based, you have to manage it in an evidence-based way as well. And I think that also applies to sort of healthcare, social care, medical care. If you want individuals within it to be evidence-based, they have to be managed in an evidence-based way. Why? Because they need the support, they need the resources, they need to not be incentivized away from kind of doing that. It's how we manage people to be evidence-based and support them in doing it is also kind of very important. So I think these are really good points, and they'll come out a little more in the discussion as we go through. So I'm now going to talk a bit about, so you told a bit about your experience. I'm going to give you an example from my experience of what making a well-informed decision makes. And I think also someone was talking about that, I think it might be, was it Jackie? When she goes on Amazon, just buys something because it looks good, or the idea some people, if they're going to buy a house, they go in and does it feel right or not? And they maybe don't bother looking at other kinds of evidence, I suppose. But for me, one of the things where decisions are really, really important, and there's not a constraining parameter like cost, where you do have some discretion about what you buy and how you choose something, then I think people tend to do very similar things. And this is an example that's important for me. So I really like food. I really like eating. I think about it all the time. I've been thinking about my lunch since breakfast. I'm thinking about dinner. I'm thinking about what I'm going to eat the weekend. So I'm constantly thinking about food. I eat to live. I don't live. Sorry, I live to eat. I don't eat to live, kind of thing. So this is an example that might be relevant to you too, but certainly is relevant for me. So this is an example that I might go somewhere. You might go somewhere. You go to a city you don't know, somewhere in Europe, and it's 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. You're in a hotel. You really, really enjoy, you're on a work trip, you really, really enjoy food and eating, and someone or your client or your customer or a friend is buying you dinner, and they say to you, look, you can choose whatever kind of dinner you want, whatever, any kind of restaurant. The cost doesn't matter, the location doesn't matter. The question are, what kind of evidence would you choose to use? I mean, would you seek out information? I'm guessing you kind of would. Would you use kind of multiple sources? Possibly. Would you think about the trustworthiness, which is not anything, I think maybe one of you mentioned in the discussion. And also, would you kind of take a structured approach? I'm going to ask you some questions about that in a second. But what I'm going to do throughout the session is ask you chat blasts. So I'm going to ask you a question. I'll tell you how long you've got to answer it. Type your answers, if you could, please, into the chat, but don't send them. So just type away, just think about the response, think about your response. You're going to have a while to do it. And then when I say go, put them into the chat, and then we'll review the answers if that's okay. And again, as Kev mentioned, you could also ask questions as we go through. So the first chat blast question is this. Then go back to this restaurant situation. You're in your hotel room. You want to choose a restaurant. You don't know the city. The question is, what types of information and evidence would you seek out to help you decide which restaurant to book in this situation? Could be any kinds of information, data, evidence, anything you can kind of get hold of. Okay, so type your answers into the chat, but don't send them yet. So you've got 30 seconds to do that, starting now. Okay, so I see you blasted the chat already, which is fine. But yeah, put now in the chat what sources of evidence you would use. So Anne-Marie says socials, yes, Instagram, TripAdvisor. Pam, who I assume is a vegetarian, says the vegetarian in me, and that's a good example of where you might say, look, I know I'm going to have a limited choice. There's only particular things I want, so I can just search on those. Holly says TripAdvisor. Kay says friends' opinions, Instagram, TripAdvisor. And I assume, Kay, you want to ask any old friend, but a friend who you knew liked food or had similar views about food to you. Recommendation concierge, yeah, great. Walk around, yeah, see which looks okay. TripAdvisor. Fiona says food hygiene rating, okay. Now, do you think food hygiene ratings are linked to how good the food is? Possibly, but certainly you could say for some people, I want to make sure that anywhere I go has a good rating, then I'll choose between those that do. So that's an example of cutting off. How far away, previous ratings, yep. Ask friends, says Joanne. Hannah says TripAdvisor, forums, what locals say. Pictures, that's really good. Sometimes you can look at pictures of food or a hotel and it gives you a feel for what you want. Online, speak to receptionist. How close is it? Fantastic. And what you're doing here is you are precisely demonstrating, use my nose, said Nigel, where the place has got queues. Now that's an interesting one. So yeah, there's often queues outside McDonald's. I'm not saying McDonald's is bad, but it might not be the kind of thing you want if you want a great dinner. How important is it? Yes, it's very important, Anton. Bad experience or problem to laugh about. Okay. So you could deliberately choose a terrible restaurant just so you had a story to tell people later. Marie says nearest places, opening time, diet. Yeah. And you're all demonstrating, I think, one of the first principles of evidence-based practice, which is that you look for multiple sources of evidence. Multiple sources of evidence. The second thing, which you haven't discussed too much, is the extent to which those different sources are trustworthy. So, for example, would you trust a concierge? Kev says no. Why not, Kev?
Sorry, I was still on mute then. No, I think because he's biased, Rob, it's a biased form of evidence for that restaurant. So he's got a vested interest in obviously getting you to go to that restaurant. So I wouldn't place a huge amount of trust in it.
The concierge might be biased because they might get little kickbacks by recommending to you. And friends in hospitality have told me that's one reason why the concierge says, tell them Rob sent you, or can I phone and book for you? Because they want to make sure they get the kickback. So it doesn't mean you don't ask them, but you might think, yeah, but maybe there's a reason they're asking me. What about TripAdvisor? Do you think TripAdvisor is reliable? I can tell you in my experience, it isn't in particular. And also, Kate says, look at models, help verify exactly. Laura says it's not 100%. No. And in fact, you may or may not know this, but for TripAdvisor, you could pay companies to put on good reviews of your restaurant, and the same companies put on terrible reviews of your competitors. You can also create restaurants that do not exist and get them listed. So there's a couple of examples kind of the last few years of people just creating restaurants that don't exist and getting their mates to rate them and really bumping them up and making them like the best restaurant in that city, and they don't exist. There's other examples of people continuing to leave reviews for places. Classic, I can't remember, it's somewhere in the West Midlands, there's a pub. The pub had been shut for about 5 years, but reviews were still appearing of how good the Sunday roast was. So again, it's not that you shouldn't look at it, but you have to be a bit aware of the sources as you would with other. So Vicky says you have to balance what's being said. Exactly. There is a kind of balancing act going on here. So just think about that. So obviously for me or you, if you're interested in food, if you're sitting in that hotel room, you're more likely to get a good meal if you use some versus no evidence, of course. As we discussed, you're more likely to get a good meal if you use multiple sources versus one. You're more likely to get a good dinner if you use information with awareness of its level of trustworthiness versus not really knowing it's trustworthy or not. In other words, what you might do is you might prioritize, and you do this in professional life as well, you might prioritize information you think is more trustworthy and deprioritize evidence that isn't. And fourthly, you might even take a structured approach. If it was really important to you, you might start making a list. Here's the top 6 restaurants that keep appearing. I'm going to kind of cut and paste or make notes on all the information to see what these different sources of evidence are saying. Now, you might not do this for dinner, absolutely, but you might do it for something else. So the point is, in this example are the basic principles of evidence-based practice. So these principles, just to repeat them, are incorporating multiple sources and types. Again, this includes qualitative evidence. It includes, a few people mentioned intuition. Intuition is potentially a source of evidence, but you have to check out how reliable it is. Principle 2 is a structured approach, and this is two-stage approach, which many of you will be familiar with. Sort of diagnosing first. I don't necessarily mean in a medical sense, but understanding what the issue is for your client or the context. And once that's understood, and then take a structured approach again to gathering the data that's going to help you answer both what's the issue and what can we do about it. And principle 3 is focused on the most trustworthy and relevant evidence, not all the evidence. So again, some of you mentioned the time this takes, and you're right, it does take time. We'll talk about the trade-offs in a minute. But one way of reducing the time is to think, I'm not going to look at all the evidence. I'm going to quickly try and decide which is more or less reliable, because if I do that, I can just not use some if I think it's not particularly reliable. Yes, Toby, you can certainly get the slides from the presentation. Absolutely, absolutely. So where do these principles come from? So when people think about evidence-based practices, it can sometimes sound a bit sciencey. Well, it's not. They don't come from science. They don't come from academics. They come from what we all, or most of us, maybe not, I've forgotten your name, but I think it was Jackie said she doesn't when she's buying things on Amazon because it's price constrained. But refining what people already tend to do when they're making a decision, that's very important to them. It's what people tend to do anyway. In other words, these are human principles, though of course it's also human to sometimes completely ignore them. I don't care what the evidence says, I just want to do this. And that's kind of human too. So let's go into a bit more depth now to develop a more detailed understanding of what evidence-based practice really means, and also what it kind of doesn't mean. Okay. So what is it? Where did it come from? And what are its principles? So I think it's worth thinking about what are the principles of any profession at all. Any profession at all. What is it for? What are we supposed to do? Essentially, I think it's to help the clients, customers, and communities that it serves. As professionals, that's what we should be doing. The question is, how can we most effectively do this? And I think it's only by understanding what are the most important issues being faced by our clients and customers. Not everything, because we haven't got the resources to do everything, but what is most important. And once we discover those, what interventions are most likely to resolve those issues? And essentially, the more accurate our understanding, the more effective we're going to be. And evidence-based practice has actually been applied in many fields to help practitioners do precisely that. So these are just some of the areas which have tried to, whether they've been successful or not, we can debate, but these are different professions that have taken this concept of evidence-based practice and tried to use it. And again, the idea that in some fields, it's quite kind of this hard data, some fields there isn't. You can see it doesn't, in a way, it doesn't matter what the nature of the data or evidence is. You can do it across different things, from philanthropy to management, architecture, education, policymaking, international development. In some of those fields, there may be a lot of science and quantitative. In other fields, there aren't. And some of you may have come across the idea of evidence-based philanthropy. And this is the idea that if you are giving money to a charity, there's a range of charities around, but which charities are themselves adopting an evidence-based practice approach to the thing they're trying to help, to the cause they're trying to help, because you should really give your money to those rather than ones that maybe aren't particularly evidence-based. So it's been in a lot of fields. And I mentioned this already, I think we can imply evidence-based practice to individual clients and needs of community, but also to the way in which we manage services. So I think evidence-based medicine needs evidence-based healthcare management. Evidence-based policing needs evidence-based police management. Evidence-based social work needs evidence-based social service management, because I think those two things go hand in hand. So at different points, I'll be talking about different levels, sometimes about what an individual does, sometimes what a manager or management team might do. So I'll be going across those different levels as we go through. I'm going to go into talk about these barriers a bit more later, but just to flag some of these again. So I think evidence-based practice is not difficult. I mean, we all kind of get it, but it's often hard in practice. So these are some I'm going to talk about later, like cognitive biases, incentives, but also things like access to evidence can be a real barrier. things like good intentions, this idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And certainly some of the areas that I get involved in, for example, more in HRM or other fields, there's often a lot of activity where people feel there's a really serious and bad problem. They really want to help. And often they have very good intentions, and often that doesn't help with evidence-based practice. Why? Because what's driving you often is to do something. The idea that we just need to do something rather than really think about what can we most effectively do to help. Sometimes our work is not evaluated. And again, if your work is not evaluated, then it makes it quite hard to justify spending time on being evidence-based practice. There's often a perceived need for speed, the idea things need to be done really, really quickly. Of course, sometimes they do, but also I think sometimes that's used as a kind of bit of an excuse to say, no, we can't slow down, we have to get to this outcome. And I'll be raising these later, but they're important to bear in mind kind of as we go through, I think. So the first question for you is, and I think one or two of you started to answer this, is why incorporate multiple sources and types of evidence in evidence-based practice? So let's do this 30-second chat blast again. I'll give you 30 seconds. I'll tell you when to send it. Write down in the chat why we use multiple sources and types of evidence. So you have 30 seconds to do that, starting now. Okay, that is 30 seconds. So you may now share your thoughts. Okay. Q, Louise says Q, okay, robustness. Kev says comparison across, yeah, it could be ID looking for contrasting evidence. You could also be looking for evidence that says the same thing or doesn't, but what's that telling you? Marie says to get the best outcome, consider alternative thoughts. Sorry, I keep not setting this. Sorry. Learn from lessons of previous strength, not duplicate work to save time. So yeah, multiple sources. Jackie says needs to be accountable. You need to give balanced decision making. Yes, is to make more informed decision. Gives you a better picture. Yeah, Vicky. One way of thinking about this, or sometimes people use this metaphor, it's like an evidence picture. Or to standardize, says Jay, to ensure that decisions are well informed, to cross-reference. Yes, Kay, that's a really important point. The idea we're cross-referencing all the time. Rachel, well-rounded, exactly. Jono, nothing is missed. Get all voices, etc. Again, the idea of picture, full picture. Yeah, data verification, checking trends, says Joanne. Claire says, yes, there's a really important word, Claire, triangulation, which we'll talk about in a minute, exactly. Different kinds of data from different sources. Jane says to avoid confirmation bias. That's what I think this person says that, but does this person say that? Or this data says that, but does this data say that? You need multiple sources, multiple types, exactly. Catherine, triangulation. Bryony says a minimum bias. Great, fantastic answers. Rahana, wider reach, trustworthiness, different angles. Yep, absolutely. And this is something, again, that's in terms of multiple sources, and Kelly again says triangulate, that's often missed. So again, in some professional contexts, people very much really focus on the scientific evidence, which is fine, but it's just one source of evidence. And that triangulation that I did multiple sources is really important. Sometimes I think about a bit like this, that you're almost being like a detective. So if you went to a court and someone had been accused of a crime, if you think about it, there'd be lots of potentially completely different sources of evidence. Okay, there'd be witnesses, there might be CCTV, there might be forensic evidence, there might be all kinds of other bits of data and evidence that you pull together to build up a reliable picture of what might have gone on and if that person's responsible for it. So that's exactly right. So yes, that is why we do it. Why do we do it? So to triangulate and cross-check evidence and data from different sources. Are we getting the same or similar answers? So Kev said the idea we may get different answers. You know, why? What does that mean? What's that telling? If we get similar answers, what does that mean? And I think also an important, again, this idea of picture or landscape, it allows you to contextualize. One of the criticisms of evidence-based medicine has been that some of the researchers and scientists and academics producing the medical evidence did not allow practitioners to think enough about the context in which they're applying it. So here's some great scientific evidence about cognitive behavioral therapy or some other intervention that might help particular clients. Great, but actually, you know what? Having spoken to my client, having understood the situation and context in which they are living and working, the other things going on in their life, even if this intervention is great, I don't think it's going to work here or it's not appropriate here. So it's also, as well as triangulation, is to contextualize. I think that's the other thing. So again, I think another example here is a bit like, again, the importance of multiple sources is if you went to see, well, can you imagine going to see your family doctor? Frankly, I can't imagine that. But most of us in the UK can't imagine that anymore. But if you could, and you went to see her and she said, right, I'm going to diagnose and treat you only by using evidence collected essentially from you. I'm going to use blood tests, MRI, CT scans, ECG, and other diagnostics, and I'm going to completely ignore all the evidence from medical science, my expertise as a doctor, and also what you, as a patient, in this case a stakeholder, believe and feel is going on. Again, if a doctor did that, you would feel she wasn't being a particularly good doctor. So this idea of multiple sources is so important as one of the basic principles of evidence-based practice. So I'm going to switch now to a slightly different discipline, which is evidence-based HR. As I mentioned, is one of the main fields in which I work. But all of you will have some experience of HR, at least dealing with HR policies and HR practices. But if you were working in HR, and we talked a bit about multiple sources, gave the example of maybe a GP, and you've also given examples in the earlier discussions. What do you think if you were working as an HR manager, or you're working in HR function in a business or an organization, what are the four main sources of evidence you might use if you're making a decision within human resource management? So just to reflect on that for a minute, these are what I think are the main sources, and these overlap pretty much with the sources of evidence you'll be using in any context. So, and these, I've got these in a kind of order. So number one is stakeholder views and perspectives. In the case of HR, that might be people like an executive committee, senior leaders, it might be line managers, employee groups and representatives, employees, and even customers and clients. So you can transfer this to your own setting and say, well, who are the stakeholders? Who are the most important stakeholders in this? What do they think is going on? Secondly, be your professional expertise. In this case, as an HR professional, but your own professional expertise. But it's what have you learned in your profession? What do professionals in other functions within the organization think? And again, if you're doing multi-agency working, you may also look at the professional views of other people. What about external professional expertise? Can you go to professional bodies where there might be professional expertise that they have gathered over many years that also kind of counts? So that's the kind of second area. The third area in this case is evidence from inside the organization. So things like employee surveys, it might be HR metrics, it might be structure and process, it might be experiments, it's data you collect from inside the organization. And the fourth area is, which we've already touched on, is the scientific evidence. It could be benchmarking, it could be case studies, but research that's from essentially outside the business that's more kind of like scientific or kind of structured research in some way. So they're the kind of four main areas. So if you think about those, how do they translate into, say, social services, for example? And these are two different quotes from different papers. So one is evidence-based practice. This is the US National Association of Social Workers, in which the practitioner combines well-researched interventions with clinical experience, ethics, client preference, and culture to guide and inform the delivery of treatments and services. And this is another one about evidence-based programs, might be like commissioning, target population, the potential program, how it should be implemented, the effects and the costs. These are just two examples. So the principles really of saying, what are the multiple sources? What should we look at? It's fairly standard, I think, across different sorts of fields, including, for example, policing as well. So the second question, and the second principle, is the idea we should adopt a structured and explicit approach. Yes, we can all agree that multiple sources is good. But why do we need a structured and explicit approach to gathering and using that evidence? I think it's because this issue of barriers is very important. And you will all know, if you try to do this, that we have a tendency to look for solutions too quickly without actually understanding the problem. So I'm just looking at Vicky's comment now. Bias, yes. Is there bias on funding? Yes, there is. You're absolutely right. Yeah, you don't want to cherry pick, exactly. So does anyone know what solutioneering means? If you've come across that term, solutioneering. Thanks, Bryony. Firm no there. Thank you. Anyone else on there? Nope, never heard of it. I think this is quite a useful concept. Solution, is it finding innovative support? Kind of, Marie, it is. Kind of. Yes, it sort of is that. Working in the problem to come to solution. No, what it is, it's doing things the wrong way around. And we all do this. We do it in our personal lives. We do it in our professional lives. We basically have already decided what the solution is. We know what it is we want to do, what the intervention is. And then we gather data and evidence to support, yes, exactly, jump into the solution before investigating the problem. You say, I want to do this, we should definitely do this, and then you just go back and pick evidence that supports that solution you've already thought of. Solutioneering is quite a strong kind of force because we tend to want to act, we tend to want to do something. And that's, again, something that really gets in the way of evidence-based practice. So that's one reason why we need a structured approach. We don't jump onto the solution. And sometimes when I'm doing training for teams around this, I say, okay, come, we're going to do a whole day on this. In the morning, as a function in an organization, it could be HR, it could be a group of managers or another kind of group. In the morning, we're going to come up with what are the 5 main, most important issues you're dealing with as a team. What are the most important things you're dealing with? And we're going to talk about the evidence for that. And then in the afternoon, we're going to talk about what solutions might help resolve those issues you've identified. Can you guess what sort of starts to happen within about half an hour in the morning? Guess what happens? Well, I'll tell you, and it happens every time. People start, yeah, exactly, Marie. People go into the solution. People jump to solving it. Okay, it's a very natural tendency to do it. It's because we want to feel we're doing something. And also, frankly, just thinking of 3 or 4 solutions is a bit easier than saying, what is the problem we're dealing with? So Toby says that solutioneering is pre-mortem analysis. Sort of, except solutioneering is also more of a bias. So the pre-mortem is where you imagine what you might do and see whether that's going to work or not. Solutioneering is more saying, I'm just going to do this anyway and find the data to support it. So it's sort of working, kind of going the wrong way around, but it's kind of related, I think, yeah. So there's this solutioneering problem. It's really easy to get lost. When we've got lots of data and evidence, we tend to think we can keep it all in our heads. It's actually quite difficult to do. Also, making a well-informed decision is not technically difficult, but there's lots of kind of barriers. So if you have a kind of structure, like doing anything, it helps you do it. Like if you want to try to do a regime about getting fitter, it really helps to have a structure because so many things will get in the way of you exercising and taking steps to sort of get a bit healthier. So if you have a structure, it can just tend to help you get through that. So thinking about the process, I mentioned the idea of a structured explicit approach. Just reflect for a moment about what you think that process might look like. So instead it's using, firstly saying what's the issue and then what can we do about it? And we said it's taking a structured approach to gathering evidence and data to answer questions, to ask questions and answer questions that will help you do those 2 things. This is a model I developed fairly recently. Again, it's applied to HR, but it applies equally well, I think, to any profession's work. And this is a 2-stage process. Now, the first thing you're going to be thinking, possibly, is what the hell is that? Which is a totally reasonable reaction. But it's not as daunting, I think, as you think, and it's there as a guide. It's not there as something to be absolutely religiously followed. So it's there as a kind of guide to steer you through. So the first part is always saying, what's the issue? Or you might use the term diagnosis, or what's even the opportunity? This can be for positive things as well. So you ask questions, 1.1, you gather evidence, 1.2, you rate the trustworthiness, 1.3, 1.4, you pull it together, and then you answer the question, what actually is the issue? You reflect on the process and outcome of you doing this. And again, you typically do this, or should do it, with a group of people within a team. And secondly, it's the same kind of process, but for saying, what can we do about it? So this is a structured process. Now I'm going to use an example. I've skipped ahead a bit. Why focus on the most trustworthy and relevant evidence? Well, I think we've already kind of discussed that, apologies, that we're surrounded by data and evidence of many types. Some of the evidence is not trustworthy. A lot of it won't be relevant. So we shouldn't include untrustworthy and irrelevant evidence because it will not lead to better informed decisions. So that's the third principle. And it's there because one model of evidence-based practice is you throw all the data in, all the evidence in, and you use it all. That's not very useful because supposing 80% of your evidence or data is really unreliable and biased, you wouldn't want to use that because it will lead to a poor informed decision, not a kind of better informed decision. So how do you judge the quality of evidence? How do you judge it? Again, of all kinds, and this is not necessarily easy to do. And it's not just about quality, it's also about relevance. So as I mentioned before, sometimes people say, look, I've got a really good piece of data here. I've got this great data, I've got this great study, and I'm just going to use it to any situation. Now, it has to be relevant to that setting, and all evidence has biases and limitations, and we need to start to identify what those are. Not necessarily in a complicated way, just to get a sense of it so we can start focusing on the most trustworthy evidence. Some of you may have seen when we're thinking about scientific evidence, this hierarchy of evidence. Just indicate in the chat if you've seen this hierarchy of evidence before. Jackie says no, Kev says yes, Fiona says yes, Marie says no. That's interesting. Quite a nice mix of answers there. Abigail says no, Kate yes, Anne-Marie yes, Toji. And my guess is those of you saying yes have probably worked in professions that are a bit more closely aligned maybe to medicine, I'm guessing, or certain areas of clinical practice. The idea of this hierarchy of evidence is it's saying if you have cause-effect claims, this intervention has this effect, then not all evidence is as trustworthy or reliable. So at the bottom of this hierarchy, you have people's opinions and anecdotes. That's not great for getting a cause-effect quantitative claims. If we do this, it will increase that. If we do this thing, it will reduce that. They are quantitative cause-effect claims. The next level is commercial non-peer-reviewed research. The next is cross-sectional studies, and that's where you measure everything in one point in time. The problem with measuring everything in one point in time is that it's only correlational, and you've probably heard this expression, a correlation between two things doesn't imply causality. So if you measure two things at the same time, all you know is that they're related. You don't know if X causes Y causes X, or indeed there's something else going on completely. Longitudinal studies where you measure things over time is good. And then you get near the top, randomized controlled trials. That's like an experiment where you might, in the case of an intervention, you say, okay, here's an intervention. We're going to give half the sample intervention, half the sample nothing, or another intervention. And then we're going to run those things. We're going to compare before and after that thing we're trying to change. That's like a randomized controlled trial. And at the top, a meta-analysis and systematic review is where you gather all the randomized controlled trials together, and then you sort of get an even stronger level of evidence, because it's not just one study, it might be 50 studies, 100 studies, 200 studies. So this is a hierarchy of evidence. Now, does anyone know, aware, those people have seen it before in particular, are you aware of any problems with this or challenges with using this hierarchy of evidence? So, for example, Anne-Marie, are you aware of any issues around using that? Or Kay, have you seen it before?
I've just what sort of
Thank you.
comes to mind for me is, you know, the link of the MMR vaccine to autism, and how there's just a link and you can produce a report and you can produce a study to say this, but actually it can be completely flawed.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jay. And Jack is saying you also use a great deal of expert experience. Anecdotes may not be considered credible. Marie says could be used to prove the answer. Yep. Brian says there might be just a lack of systematic reviews. There may be grey literature. There may be other things. You're absolutely right. And I think the other challenge is that this hierarchy of evidence is only good. Yeah, Kate says exactly how systematic reviews. This hierarchy of evidence is only good for very particular questions. So sometimes it's over applied. So sometimes, you know, talking to, you know, some clients around an issue may be the best quality data you can get to answer that question. For other questions, the idea of this kind of hierarchy may not make any sense at all. So you have to be really careful, because it has been a bit over applied to say, oh, you know, the best thing is a randomized control trial. Well, it is for some questions, But many of the questions we have as practitioners are not quantitative cause effect questions, they're other kinds of questions. So as I say, it's really important to think about the quality of the data, but not apply frameworks that just don't make sense for some kinds of questions. So another way of thinking about this is that if you look at the different questions on the left, effectiveness, does A work better than B? That's what we just talked about. Randomized control trial is pretty good. If you go to the right, qualitative research isn't very good for that. Explanation, how does something work? Again, things like qualitative research is really good. But if you go down, acceptability, if you want to know if an intervention is acceptable, then a randomized controlled trial probably is not going to answer that question. But again, qualitative research might. And prevalence, how often has something happened? A cross-sectional survey might be fine. So the point is, as they use that expression, is horses for courses. Whatever question you're asking, the most trustworthy and relevant evidence depends a lot on the question. So just because you don't have quantitative data, you haven't done an experiment, it doesn't matter. It depends on the question. And that, I think, is the really important thing. And also, it's not just about the scientific evidence from whatever source it's coming. We still need to think about the quality of the data or information we're getting. So even if it's talking to stakeholders, as you'll be aware, I think someone said actually in one of the chat groups I was in, just because your stakeholders tell you something, is it trustworthy? Is it reliable? Sure, they're saying it, but what does it really mean? What is it actually telling you as a professional? This is something that I designed to very quickly trying to judge the quality of any piece of data or evidence, whether it's a discussion, whether it's a survey, whether it's whatever setting it comes. So do you understand, are you confident you understand how the evidence was collected? Do you understand what it's telling you in relation to your question? Do you understand how the evidence can, in principle, provide an answer to your question? Are you confident the evidence is largely unbiased? And are you confident it's largely error-free? Now, if you're giving a lot of ones and twos, you should probably go back and check it out again and think, you know, maybe we should try and find some better evidence or emphasize that better evidence. If you're giving threes, that's great. It probably means it's reasonably relevant and reasonably trustworthy. So I've told you about the three principles.
Rob,
yeah.
Sorry, and
Please.
I'm not conscious that if I put my hand up, you might not be able to see me. I was just going to ask, in terms of data, is there a threshold? Because, you know, when we collect data, sometimes we collect data from a section of people, and often you'll find that they'll say, well, we collected data for 1,500 people, you know, out of a population of 3 million, and we're going to put a lot of weight on this data of those of 1,500 people.
Yeah.
Is there any threshold in terms of trustworthiness around that, or is it just that you know that makes it trustworthy then? Because the ratio of people who responded versus the population could be very different.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, if you look at sort of political opinion polls, what some pollsters would say is if they collect the sample really carefully, like they just don't randomly choose the first 1,500 people, they really choose it carefully, and they choose it based on data they've already got from previous opinion polls, they argue you can get quite reliable answers from quite a small sample. So what you really need to know is if someone's making a claim about a survey, if you say 1,500 people from 6 million people, whatever it is, you need to know a little bit about, well, how do they get that sample? What was it kind of based on? Because in general, yes, just to say that is necessarily reliable is a mistake. It could be, but it might not be. And that's a real challenge, actually, Jackie, in terms of being presented with data, someone telling you it's reliable, and you're thinking, wait a minute, is it? And I think there are some basic questions you can kind of ask to give you more of a sense of that. And in particular, you can think about, are there, back to the example of drug companies that someone gave, are the vested interests in somebody putting this spin on it? So it's a little bit like solutioneering. Sometimes people want to implement something, and rather than really looking at the evidence and data that might support implementing that thing, what they do is they run a survey, which is often a little bit biased, and then they get the results and say, oh yeah, people want this. Well, do they? Maybe they do, but you're right. It is difficult. Yes. So essentially, you just have to try and ask a few more questions. And if the people who've done the research are uncomfortable answering them, or don't have the answers, then I think you can be quite skeptical about it. Yeah. Thank you. Great question. Thank you. Any other questions then about, so just discuss these 3 principles: multiple sources, structured approach, most trustworthy and relevant evidence. And again, I would hang on to those. So in terms of your own work, I would say if you remember those 3 things as basic principles, I think that takes you a long way towards being evidence-based, even if you haven't got much time. So going back to my hotel choosing a restaurant example, even if I only had 5 minutes to do research across exactly the sources you mentioned, the different kinds of information, I'm still more likely to get a good dinner than if I didn't do that. Now, maybe if I spent 10 minutes, it increases the chances and we're getting an even better dinner. And obviously, maybe if I spend more than an hour, it's not going to make any difference. So the point about all this, if you've got those 3 principles, if you devote the resources you can to following those as much as you can, the chances are you will become more effective as a practitioner and be more able to help your clients. So again, it's all about making perfect decisions. Think about those principles. So here's an example of evidence-based practice in the workplace. Again, it's from HR, just because it's a recent example for me. And it's presenting problem in a business or organization of high turnover. So again, that's probably something that affects some of your organizations in some way, that basically there's a perception that employees or some staff are leaving too quickly. They're not hanging around enough. And that can also cause problems, of course. So what's the issue? So this model starts with an awareness of what is seen to be an important business or organizational issue. And this presenting problem, if you like, is high turnover. How would you approach this as, say, a team, an HR team in this case, to think through, you've been told this is an issue, how would you actually approach it? These are the 6 steps I mentioned. And again, you can go through these very fast, that's okay. But the first thing is to ask answerable questions to identify the issue. So what is the problem? Where is it happening? Who is leaving? What is the rate? Are the trends? What is our turnover rate, for example, compared to others? And why is it even a problem? So what do we think the problem is? We look across the 4 sources I mentioned. We might talk to stakeholders. We look at organizational data. We might look at the scientific evidence. We'd use our expertise to say, what could be the problem be? This problem with high turnover here. You then rate the trustworthiness of it and the relevance of it. So you're focusing on the most trustworthy, most relevant. Then you go back and pull the answers together, and you display or summarize that. And then you say, well, what exactly is this issue of high turnover? So is it one problem? Is it several problems? Is it completely different things across the organization? How serious is it? Do we need to intervene? What's the cost benefit sort of suggest? So that's just part 1 of saying what's the issue. And then we reflect on the process and the decision outcome. Was it hard? Was it easy? Were there gaps? There always are gaps. Did it change your perception? Are you fairly confident, etc.? And then you do the same thing or a similar thing for part 2. What can we do about it? So we may have identified that in our organization, turnover is particularly high amongst this particular group of employees, and this is causing significant problems to the organization. It's causing costs. So what can we actually do about that? And you do the same thing. You talk to stakeholders. You think about your professional expertise. You look at organizational data that might give you a clue about what you can do. And you'd also look at the scientific evidence to say what kind of might work to deal with this issue now identified of high employee turnover. So it's kind of a management example, but as you can see, you can apply it to other things. And this is the same process for what can we do about it. So thinking about your own professional life, one of those questions asked before, now I've given you a definition of evidence-based practice, and I've given you a model that's pretty similar to models that you use everywhere. I've given you an example. If you remember that, and if you did it in the initial breakout group, you gave a rating to how professional you thought you were in your own, or how evidence-based you were in your professional life. Has your score gone up, down, or stayed the same since you heard what we've just presented? So if you just type in the thing, if your score's gone up, down, or same. Kate says same. Down, same. Okay. Up, same. Okay. So, of course, I don't know where you started. Marie says down. The same. Yeah. Okay. So typically, you get this kind of mix where some people feel like, now I've seen it. Yeah, I gave myself a 4. I'm probably still a 4. Whereas other people who may have given themselves an 8, sometimes look at it and go, yeah, you know, I do some of it, but not all of it. And maybe I should be more like a 6. So it's worth reflecting on how much you actually kind of do that. Thanks for that. So you now give you a slightly longer 90-second chat blast. You've seen the principles, you've seen an example, you've seen a model. Write down any questions or concerns you have about evidence-based working, and don't hit send until 90 seconds. I'll tell you when that is, and then put them in the chat. So you've seen that. What questions, doubts, concerns, criticisms, what problems, issues you see around evidence-based practice, evidence-based working in your own context. Okay, so you've got 90 seconds starting now. Okay, great comments. I'm going to go through some of them. Louise says, I work hard against my natural instinct to solutioneer every day. Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, when a decision is really important, it's sort of natural to try and make a good decision, but it's also quite natural, I think, to solutioneer. Just like, oh, I want to do this thing, just get on with it. Jono says, what is the problem? Isn't really a problem yet. So yeah, systems processes are already too baked in to allow for evidence-based change. Yeah, I think there often there are systems and structures in place that people very heavily, if I think about my own work or the part of my job in the university, there's lots of things we do that make absolutely no sense to me or to most people doing it, but to use your expression, Jono, it's too baked in. People spend a lot of time working on it. They've implemented things, they've revised it, they've adjusted it, they've tweaked it, and it's a system there. And you think, why are we doing this? But it's very difficult politically to change it. And you say, what's really the problem? Isn't the problem, again, this is really important as well, I think, that often we run away, sort of, as it were, trying to solve a problem without really understanding what that problem is. So obviously waste a lot of time. If we keep spending resources and efforts trying to fix something that isn't kind of broken, or we're fixing the wrong thing, it just means you have to go back again and again to kind of do it. Time, Louise, absolutely. Yes, it is time. And again, I would say, going back to the restaurant example, perhaps even the fitness example, you could say, I haven't got any time to exercise. Maybe, but you might have a little bit of time, and a little bit of time might be better than doing none, for example. And I think it's the same with this. Even if you've only got a little bit of time, it's still better to spend that trying to do this a bit, just say, I haven't got time. Yes, coaching teams, services to move quickly to solutions. Yep, people love a solution. They love rolling things out. Kev says, report lack of time. Yeah, lack of knowledge used effectively. Yep. And I think, again, to repeat the points I've been trying to make throughout, I think it's quite important we don't think about it as a deeply technical thing. You can get into that too. But if that feels very, very far away from where you are now, just think about those 3 principles. But yeah, if you think, my God, it's this very bureaucratic, incredibly complicated thing, you're just not going to do it. Jackie says time, resources, yeah, getting hold of papers, and the culture, the norms around, are we evidence-based or not? Rachel says, what about the evidence-based and issue you want to suppose limited? Great question, Rachel. Well, that is always true. You're absolutely right, but it's always true. So again, back to me in that hotel room, trying to find out about restaurants, maybe you only got access to a couple of websites, that's it. It's going to be limited. But the idea is, as long as it's reliable and relevant, you're still more likely to get a better dinner. But you're absolutely right, it's always limited. And the advantages, I think, of trying to look for the evidence and data, it means that next time you do it, you're more aware of where those gaps are, and maybe you can start to put some resource into filling those gaps. So Vicky also says gaps in data, E&D data. I'm not sure what E&D data is. Quality and diversity, could be that. So it's quite hard to take action where you don't have the data. A challenge. Claire says, the ability to convince and bring along others who do not want to work in this way. Well, there's a couple of things there. The first, Claire, is leadership. If your boss or your boss's boss or your boss's boss doesn't want to do this, it's really hard for you to do it. So it depends, that's maybe what people mean by culture. It's that kind of leadership thing. And how do you bring others along? Well, one way I try and do it is I sort of say to people, look, do you want to be more effective in your job? Most people go, yes. And I say, do you want to focus on what's really important for your clients or customers? And we go, yes. And they go, okay, and do you want to do things that are more likely to work? They go, yes. And then you put the challenge back to them. How are you going to do that? And typically, if you say, how are you going to do that? They actually come up with evidence-based practice. They actually say, well, we need to find out more. Go, great, let's try and do that. But you're right, it is a challenge, but I think if you try and get people to reflect on their own professional values, I think that's quite a useful way of doing it sometimes.
Just come in there. Sorry.
Please, of course, Claire.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
It's an interesting dynamic because I come from a very clinical, evidence-based background of 40 years in NHS management. I'm now in a non-exec director role and a consultancy role within the NHS. So it's trying to make that connection between my norm of quite deep-rooted decision-making and clinical decision-making and evidence-based practice into organisations who perhaps are solutioneering completely. And I'm either being very irritating by looking at the evidence and trying to challenge some of that. And I think we're getting there, but it's an interesting journey.
Yes,
I have to say.
you. Great, Claire. Thank you very much. And it is, and sometimes I'm not saying you're doing this, Claire, but sometimes I get approached by people who say, I can see you've done stuff on evidence-based management or practice or policing, and I'm going mad because I'm in my business and organization. I'm trying to do this and no one will listen to me. I always call them the lone wolves, but the lone wolf who kind of can see, or sometimes they feel like in the Emperor's New Clothes, they're the little boy or girl who's pointing at the emperor saying that emperor's is naked, they haven't got any clothes on, and everyone else seems to think they have. You're thinking, why can no one else see this? Is that your experience a bit, Claire?
Well, it is, but it's also I do a lot of governance work, so it's the balance actually between reassurance and assurance, and where we use evidence-based practice to provide the assurance, the don't tell me, show me moment, where I'm trying to encourage the gathering of that evidence, which could be evidence-based, it could be organisationally generated evidence to actually support some of the big statements. So it's interesting.
Yeah,
times.
and I think absolutely the point again I made a couple of is I don't think evidence-based practice is conceptually difficult. I think everyone in principle gets it, but it's really hard to do it in practice for some of the reasons exactly you've said. Yeah, it's really difficult, amazingly difficult sometimes. Yeah, and infuriating sometimes as well.
Indeed.
Because you think I'm trying to help here, and people might see you just being slightly irritating or getting in the way or slowing things down. And sometimes people say, oh, this is just slowing us down. I go, yes, it is slowing us down. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Not always, but usually it is. Let's slow down. Let's actually think about it. But it is, as I said before, I think it's harder, and I think it's more unsettling for a group of practitioners to really look at what the problem or issue is, because it's quite often we don't really know, and we're quite uncertain, and we're not used to dealing with a lot of uncertainty, I think. So I think you also have to give people permission to say, yes, it is uncertain, but that's kind of normal. That's okay. It's about like likelihoods and probabilities. So back to me getting a good dinner. I'm not trying to prove which restaurant in the city is the best restaurant. All I'm trying to do is get a better dinner to increase my chances. And it's that kind of, that kind of argument I think you need, rather than I've got to get the answer and some perfect thing. Thank you very much, Claire. Thanks. So Jane says, need to consider the problem, what actually before trying to solve it. it is sticking to a structured approach can be challenging, and I'm going to say in a minute. But what you can do is say, let's set a time limit. Let's say we've got whatever, 2 hours, whatever it is. That's our time limit. And sometimes people say, oh, what about analysis paralysis? Where you're analysing data, look, there's so much you don't get anything done. I've never seen analysis paralysis, ever. I don't think it exists. What exists is people not wanting to make a decision and using the fact they need more data as an excuse to not make a decision. You can always make a decision with very limited data, we do, but you need to be clear about that's what you're doing. But yes, pressurizing, Zoe says capacity, Avi says time, Vicky says time again, yeah, disengage. And people disengage when you're giving them the evidence. Vicky, it sounds like this based on personal experience of trying to share and people just going, oh, yeah, that can't we just get on with it? Oh, why is she telling us about evidence? Oh, come on. Yeah. And Jade says it omits that. Yeah, it does. And it can exactly do that. It can, and it shouldn't. An idea of co-production, or it shouldn't do that. It should be part of the way in which you get and work with stakeholders to get data and evidence. But if you omit that, you're going to be missing a really important source of data. Kate says, yeah, getting cooperation is not easy. I usually get accused of going overboard. Yes, exactly. Information are not perfect. They're absolutely not. Maybe absent. Yeah. And again, I think that thing where people say, oh, it's too much information and we can't trust that. You go, yeah, we can't completely trust it, but it might help. It might help us get to a better informed decision. Marie says top tips for rating evidence for reliability and accuracy. It's a bit there in the list I gave before in terms of saying, do I understand how it was collected? Do I believe it's actually answering the question? So the little checklist I put up before can help you do that. I'll also show you a checklist later for trying to not remove, but deal in some way with biases. Abigail says time, yeah. Capacity, law, demand, yeah, law, yeah. Difference of opinion, yep, there always are, or often are, Anton. Time again, times come again. Access to data, yeah, keeping up to date. Leaves as evidence as data, you're absolutely right. You don't have the time or capacity to deep dive. How do you get the decision makers to understand true evidence-based, but not solution? Yes, you're absolutely, and there is this kind of decision makers, leaders, others, Rihanna, who don't necessarily they think it's about a particular thing. It's my evidence is better than your evidence, and so we're going to do that. Yeah, reflexive practice, Jane. Yes, I think it, and that goes back to drawing on that source of professional expertise. What is that expertise? What do I really think? Can I trust it? What is it telling me? And exactly practice in depth. And often I find people use professional expertise, but they don't do it very reflexively or very critically. So it's always going to be there because that's the first thing we turn to because we already have it. But yeah, Jackie says fear of change. Rachel says thank you too. Oh, I see, I have to leave. Sorry. Thank you. Everyone says giving too much details. Oh, like it, Louis. Slow down to go faster. Nice one. Yeah, managing expectations. Always looking to me for solutions. Insights can be helpful. Yeah, great. Thank you. Great answers. That they are all totally sensible, reasonable concerns about using evidence-based working. So just some reflections on that. Firstly, we don't know much of it now because of those barriers you talked about, and I'll talk about those in a minute. It often can seem complicated and time-consuming, but if it's a really important business or client issue, then it's really worth investing the time because it saves resources later and reduces errors. As they say about health and safety, if you think evidence-based practice is time-consuming, try the alternative. But it does also depend on access to evidence and data and the function's capability. So one way to think about evidence-based practice within a function, a department, within an organization, is it's almost like organizational development for the organization, in that you have to change potentially the way you do a lot of your work. So to enable you to get access to that data and evidence, if you never invest time and resources in improving access to evidence and data of all kinds, you're never going to start using it more. So that needs to be something that's done over time. And again, back to the restaurant, even doing it quickly and partially, you're still more likely to understand the issue and get an effective solution. And even if you miss out part of the process, you're still likely. So fundamentally, it's about making a better informed and not a perfect decision. That's not what we're trying to do. Sometimes, I think some of you will be able to relate to this. I sometimes feel that the cave person on the left offering the round wheels is saying, look, this is going to help you. And the other cave people with their square wheels are going, no, we're too busy. And it really feels like that's a lot sometimes. The people saying, we're so busy, we've got to get on with stuff. And if you say, fine, here's a better way for you to get to the outcome you want. No, we're too busy. I think it's a major barrier as well. So now I'm going to talk about some barriers. I'm not going to talk about all of them I listed before, but just some of them. And to repeat, I think it's to help us get better at doing it. It's really important to appreciate some of the things that get in the way. We almost don't even realize are getting in the way. So the first one, I think, is misconceptions. So again, it says HR, but it applies to all fields. I think that evidence-based practice means using evidence. It's all about hard data. It's all about following the science. It's the same as in the case of evidence-based HR, people analytics. It takes too much time. It stops us from innovating and trying new things. It's just too hard. I think these are all slight, I understand why people have them, but I think they're slight misconceptions that sort of act as a barrier to it. So if you take things like innovation or experimenting, innovating and experimenting should come at the end of that evidence-based practice process. So you really understand what the issue is, you really understand what the available solutions is, and it may be that none of those solutions are going to be effective. So you need to think of a new thing. That's where innovation comes in. Innovation is in itself evidence-based. The same with experimenting. You get to the end of that process and you may say, well, we've got 2 or 3 potential solutions, but we think they're going to work the same. Maybe we need to experiment and see which one's going to be better. So it doesn't stop you from innovating and experimenting. It actually allows you to innovate and experiment. So that's the first barrier. The second is fads and fashions. And again, I don't know if you, this is again politically difficult, but you may want to, in the chat box, type things in that you think, ways of working or frameworks or concepts that are around in your organization, your profession, that you suspect may be kinds of fads and fashions, whatever they might be. You may not think of any, but there may be some. But certainly in HR, they seem quite common. They're very distracting. They become very widely followed, and they encourage, again, going back to solutioneering, we define a problem by the absence of a solution, and often that solution is some new, exciting, shiny thing. So we hear that another service, another organization is doing this thing. There's a best-selling book about it. There's some TED Talks about it. And we see that thing. We really want to do it because it looks great. And then we basically collect evidence and data that supports the use of that thing. So fads tend to do that. And it also makes it difficult to make a well-informed decision because people are coming along with solutions or non-solutions to non-defined problems. So in my view, fads in many, many areas of professional life, many kinds of organizations, they really get in the way of evidence-based practice. So this is something I developed, it's called a red flags for fads. So if you think about some of the things that are very dominant, maybe, or new things that are around, these are some flags you can check. And if you get maybe more than 8, 9 of these, probably what you're dealing with is a fad. So they're attractive, they're really appealing, they're simple, they are prescriptive, they tell you what you should do, they're falsely encouraging, they promise to have this great effect on lots of stuff, but they probably don't. One size fits all, they're easy to cut and paste, they're in tune with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, they fit with other things going on, they're novel, not radical, they sound new, but they're probably not any different from things that were being done 20 years ago. They're legitimized by gurus, disciples, and cool organizations. So their credibility comes from the opinions of influences, their followers, and fairly unscientific examples from current superstar organizations or businesses, rather than a good quantity of good quality evidence. And particularly they are FOMO inducing. They are the feeling of missing out, so the fear of missing out. And because you fear you're going to miss out, what you tend to do is to grab that thing. You think, oh, if I don't get that now, if I don't do that now, then I'm going to miss out and everybody else will be doing it. Jack has put here, weighting well and even the strengths-based approaches? Yeah, I think there is. So the strengths-based is quite what I would say, not all of it, but a lot of the strengths-based stuff ticks a lot of these red flags. Not that there's nothing in it. And I think the same is true, again, in my view, of quite a lot of the other positive psychology sorts of ideas, that they have that kind of feel about them. It may be over time they'll turn out not to be fads, but certainly at the moment, yeah. And Vicky exactly says things go around in circles, ways of working, they come back again, often with another name. And it's really interesting talking to seasoned, if I use that word, seasoned professionals about this, because if you talk to them about the new things that are coming along, they often just give a wry smile or kind of roll their eyes, because you say, wait a minute, we were doing this 15 years ago, it didn't really work, but it was called something else. It's a bit like some forms of reorganization. So the idea is you decentralize. Everyone goes, that's great, let's decentralize. Then you, oh no, that doesn't work. Let's centralize. Let's decentralize. Because these things seem to be the latest thinking in how you organize stuff. Yes, typically they don't seem to work very well. So FOMO inducing and without focus purpose. So an easy check for a fad, I think, if it's one question saying, if you ask the question, for which specific problem is this practice the answer? If you can't really answer it, it's probably a fad, but there's other ways of thinking about it as well. So these are really important barriers. Now, we talked about the idea, you mentioned that idea, some of this is human. I want to ask you a question. Think about your kitchen. Think about the cupboards in your kitchen, assuming you have a kitchen and cupboards. Most of us have a cupboard in the kitchen that has plug-in or other kinds of electrical kitchen gadgets, kitchen equipment that you now hardly ever or never use. So I'm going to do a 30-second chat blast. Don't send your answers. Just think about, if you have a cupboard, what's in that cupboard, and make a list of the things in that cupboard of equipment, gadgets, electrical stuff, other stuff that you hardly ever use now. I'll give you 30 seconds to do that, starting now. Okay, let's see what we've got. Yes, Claire, food processor. Joanna says raclette, a classic. Brian says ice cream maker, waffle maker, fondue set. A good way of looking at this is if you go to local charity shops, you often see it. Jane, apple chopper. Kelly, toasty maker. Zoe, toasty maker again. Food processor. Marie, George Foreman grill, classic. Juicer, veg chopper, processor, coffee machine, pans for big oven. There's now use air fryer. I'll come on to air fryers later. Still keep them. Omelette maker, says Rachel. Kate says blender stick. Use once. Great, Kate. Spiralizer. Use once. Juice maker. Use twice. Louise says coffee maker, toaster, microwave, mixer. Avi says lemon juicer. Laura, blender, slow cooker, hand blender, smoothie maker, toasty maker again. Vicky says slow cooker, food processor. Bullet, Vicky. Fiona says bread maker. Anne-Marie says blender, ninja chopper. Anna says, I use most of mine. Great, but there is a milk frother. Now, if you think about that and think back to when you bought those things, or possibly gifted them, but yeah, think about those things. Think about when you look in that cupboard now, how do you feel about all those things? It's like, I don't know, sometimes think, why did I buy that? What was it kind of for? And these are some examples that typically people have. And you've mentioned kind of most of these. So yeah, in the top there's the Jamie Oliver, or that kind of, not Jamie, but that kind of pasta maker, fondue, got the clap, food processor, bread maker, toaster, steamer, juicer. Now, let's take juice as an example. I estimate, and this is not very good evidence, what percentage of all the juicers that people buy in the world are used for more than maybe a month? My guess is it's tiny, like maybe 2-3%. So all around the world, there are basically unused juicers in people's cupboards. Now, in that sense, it doesn't matter if it's a personal decision. It's a bit of a waste of money, sure, but it doesn't really affect other people that much. You could say it affects the planet if you wanted to get into that, because it's going to create a landfill eventually, it wastes resources. It probably does. But imagine you're also doing this on an organizational level, that you're buying stuff that really doesn't have much value or use. And of course, someone did mention this, but I think the new kitchen gadget, now who is still using their air fryer? And they threw everything else away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Marie. Yeah. So are you still an enthusiastic air fryer, Marie? Vicky
Yeah,
said
I've got
yes.
two.
You've got two to use them at the same time. Very impressive. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You still, yeah. And my guess is what will happen is with things like air fryers, a bit like fads and fashions in management or other kinds of fields, is that for some people, like a juicer, like a food processor, that will be really useful for them and they'll carry on using it for a long time. I guess there's other things that will turn out sort of not to be very valuable. But it's important that, say, it's a human thing to buy stuff because we think it's cool without always thinking through whether it would be of any value. Now, just to show I'm just the same as everyone else, do any of you have a banana guard? Do you recognize this banana guard? Have you got one, Vicky? You're kind of nodding, or you just like the idea of a banana guard.
Yeah, I've got one too.
Do you use it?
I send my little boy to school with it in his bag to stop it getting squashed in his school bag.
Great, good for you. Rihanna, she uses it.
Yeah.
People at work laugh, says Rihanna. Well, how dare they? This is just a personal example of something I bought, which turned out to be, more like a fad. Like I didn't really need it. So I saw these in a Lakeland shop. I'm not even sure if Lakeland still exists. I think it does. Kitchenware shop. And I bought it. Wow, this is years, like 15 years ago. Oh, this is really cool. I love it. I'm going to get one. I bought one for me. I bought one for my friends, a couple for mates. I gave them. And then when I got back home, Louise uses hers too. Oh, Rihanna says not all bananas fit. Well, controversial, but yes, I think you're probably right. But and you may use yours. Again, some people do. But so I bought this. I took it home, and the next day I was going to work, and like you do, I put a banana in it, which did fit. Put it in my bag, took it to work, went off with my bag, and then about 11, 12 o'clock, I remembered I had a banana. I got it out. I ate the banana. Great. The next day I did this. Put banana in my bag. It was fine. The third day I did this, I kind of forgot it was there. And it slipped to the bottom of the bag. And like for, some weeks afterwards, I kept opening my bag and I could smell banana. And I was thinking, wow, where's that coming from? I eventually remembered it was because of this banana guard with a banana in it that had been there for weeks. I took the banana guard out. I put it on the kitchen counter. I threw away the banana. And after some months, I just then recycled the banana guard. I just stopped using it. And the reason I did is because when I saw it, a bit like solutioneering, it created a sort of number one, in my life, I'm very rarely more than maybe 4 minutes away from a banana. I'm always in a situation where I could just pop out and get a banana. I'm very close to shops. I live in urban environments. I can always just go and get a banana if I need one. Number two, I never had a problem with squashed bananas in my life. So by seeing this gadget, I thought, oh, that will help me. It'll stop my bananas from getting squashed, which never have been squashed, and it'll help me carry around bananas. I don't need to carry around bananas. I never carry around bananas anyway. So it's a really good example of how we sort of see things that are attractive and fun and interesting. We get them. Sometimes they're very useful, sometimes we're not. And if you've been standing with me in Lakeland and said, you know what, Rob, do you really need that banana guard? What's the evidence going to help you? I would be really annoyed with you. I would just say, yeah, but I just want to buy it. I just want it. Even though you probably would have persuaded me in the end to not buy it. If you go on Amazon, you can see that the things people also buy if they buy a banana guard. And these are things that people who bought banana guard also buy. On the left-hand side, there's a Fruit Faces inflatable fruit case. I don't know if any of you bought one of those, but the idea is it's a case that you kind of put like a peach or a nectarine in and you inflate it and you seal it. It's got a zip around the edge. So obviously whoever bought the banana guard has this general fear of squashed fruit for some reason. Their bag probably goes back to childhood. They also buy a banana tree, one of those things you hang bananas on that's supposed to, is it supposed to stop them going ripe or to not make other fruit? I can't remember, but that. And they also, the far right, it's made of foam, and they also bought a banana-shaped stress reliever, which always seems a bit odd to me, because if you have a fear of squashed fruit, I don't see why squashing a foam banana would help you be any less fearful of that. But anyway, so yes, I bought a banana guard. I'm just the same as everyone else. We kind of do this. And this really gets in the way, like fads and fashions of evidence-based practice. The third barrier I want to talk about is theatre. And this is going to be HR theatre, but I think it applies to almost every profession. Anne-Marie, which do you like, Anne-Marie? Do you like the idea of the fruit faces, inflatable fruit case?
I like the faces. Yeah.
You like the okay, good. You add it, to your banana. You need one. You need one. Quick, go on Amazon and buy one. HR theatre. So the idea of theatre is it's adapted from security theatre. So after 9/11, there were lots of security measures introduced into airports. Many of which we still feel now, 100 milliliter liquids, all that kind of stuff, scanning and screening. So, and they're described by Schneider as security measures that make people feel more secure without doing anything to actually improve their security. So typically you get a lot of initiatives. Yes, of course, some of those may be effective. A lot are going to not make any difference to security, and some may do more harm than good. So this is from around the time when these measures were being introduced. And you see at the top left, airport security in America is a sham, it's security theatre. Under that, experts, TCA, Transport Security Authority, screening is security theatre. Is screened as security theatre. On the top right, taking lighters away is security theatre. So the idea is that the Transport Service Administration, it was doing things that looked like they were meant to make you more secure, but a lot of people are saying a lot of these things probably making any difference to the problem or the idea that someone could, blow up a plane like 9/11. The same is being applied, and I apologise for those of you with sensitive disposition. You probably didn't want to see a picture of Boris Johnson this morning, or maybe you did. And if you did want to see it, congratulations, you got your wish. So exactly the same happened during lockdown. So again, lots of us were doing things like wiping down packages, and you still see this sometimes in buildings, or the legacy of it. There's lots of things for wiping surfaces, for example. And a lot of that activity was, again, called hygiene theatre. Again, how excessive cleaning gives us a false sense of security. Why does cleaning and wiping surfaces not matter for COVID-19? Well, mostly because it's the way it's where you catch it, the way it's kind of distributed is through droplets in air, not through surfaces. And that's not true of all viruses. Some are, but in the case of COVID-19, wiping things down, it just doesn't really matter. It may help with other things, but it doesn't help with the transmission of COVID-19 in particular. What, of course, does matter is things like masking and ventilation, those kinds of things. We can also apply it to HR, and you may want to think about your own specific area of work, your own organisation. We can also apply it to our own profession. So in HR, you get things that are often just done to give the impression that they're trying to help with the problem, but maybe not. Classic examples of these are things like unconscious bias training, mental health first aid, and annual performance appraisals. Each of these are kind of the best available evidence, suggests they're not very effective in resolving the problems they're supposed to resolve. Yes, there are those problems, but like either with sort of bias or mental health or with managing people's performance, but those particular techniques are probably not particularly useful. Sometimes people say, well, they can't do any harm. It can't do any harm to make people do this, but even doing harmless things causes secondary harmful effects. So it wastes resources. You shouldn't ask people to do things if it wastes their time and resources. It gives the impression that something's being done when it's not. And it also distracts people from the real cause and problem solution. So you clean things when you don't have to, and it distracts people, think, oh, I've dealt with that now, I've cleaned the surface. Well, you haven't. You haven't had any impact on it. It also can cause cynicism. And in the case of HR, it gets in the way of HR as a function, because the focus is on saying, look at all the stuff we're doing. It's impression management rather than HR effectors. And I say you might want to reflect about your own profession, but in general, most professions, I would say there's a set of things they do that actually are more designed to give an impression that they're tackling and dealing with something rather than those things being effective. So Toby's come in.
I'm just going to say, Toby's put something in the chat.
I've got it.
You want to,
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, unconscious bias training isn't effective. It depends what you mean, but no. So it depends what you think it's trying to do. So if you say the idea of unconscious bias training is to make people more aware of their biases, so it reduces bias, the best available evidence is it doesn't particularly reduce bias. So, and even if it does, the effect only might last maybe a couple of weeks. And even if it does, it's not clear that reduction in bias impacts on behavior. So the logic of doing it, Toby, is that you say, okay, so here's a bunch of people, their bias is shaped, maybe you're selecting people for a job, their bias is affecting their behavior, say in a job selection type context or dealing with a client. What we need to do is make them aware of their bias, tell them, you know, that they've got this bias, that will give them strategies for reducing that bias, and then that will shape the behavior. That general idea is not really supported much at all by now, I would say, reasonable quantity of reasonable quality evidence. So I don't know, how do you feel about that, Toby? If anything. I'll wait for you to come back if you want to, Toby, if you want to say something. Yeah. What does work? Okay, good question. It depends on the problem. So again, I'm not saying you're doing this, but you're not you, but that is sort of starting at the wrong end. When it comes to things like EDI, you have to say, what is the problem or issue or opportunity? What are we actually dealing with? And typically that doesn't happen. What happens is people throw lots of things at it, including unconscious bias training, which aren't particularly effective anyway, and also not particularly effective because you don't know what the kind of issue is. So I think the same is true actually with mental health, I think, because what most of us are aware, there are issues around discrimination and racism, which we may find personally unacceptable. We tend to think of just what can we do, what can we do, what can we do, without thinking what is a specific issue or problem. Yes, people are biased. Yes, we are all racist. We all have discrimination. We all have biases. Fine. What's the problem? What are you trying to deal with? So in the case of, say, bias at work, it may be what's more effective is not changing what's going on in people's heads or trying to do that, but changing systems and structures and processes. Some of you may have heard this classic example. I actually don't even know if it's true, which is, I think it was the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, who were, obviously for hundreds of years have auditioned musicians to play in that orchestra. It's a very prestigious orchestra to play in. And they, over time, lots of people saying, how come like 95% of your musicians are men? So what they tried to do is try and deal with that problem. But the way they did it was not by giving unconscious bias training to the people listening to the auditions. What they did is something else, is they put a curtain up. So the people doing the auditions could not see the people were. And again, this could be apocryphal. I even heard that also what they did is they told the musicians to take their shoes off on the basis that women's and men's shoes might sometimes sound different. So people will be aware of that, listen to the audition. So in the case of what the problem is, it may be that there are structural things you can do, not, trying to change people's heads or whatever. Oh yeah, thank you, Vicky. Musical band company. Yeah, when there's exactly, if you're trying to judge the quality of what you're hearing, don't look at it, because that's going to bias you. Yeah, exactly. And actually, that might apply to all kinds of biases. Yeah. It could be about adult conversation, it could be about all kinds of things. And the other thing is about unconscious bias training and some DEI training in general is also can have a backlash effect, in that there's a view that if you suggest to people they are racist, which everyone is, but if you point this out to them, they may feel quite offended by that. And it may even sort of retrench their views because you're telling them they're doing something wrong. And quite often those biases we have, and that basically is not something you can just click your fingers and fix. It's not really that kind of issue for most of us. So yeah, so it could be that's not the problem. The same is true of mental health first aid. So for example, there's now reasonable quantity of good quality evidence to say it doesn't do what it's intended to do. Yes, it does increase, those people who do the training have an increased awareness and knowledge of mental health, but it doesn't seem to have any impact generally on the mental health of employees in the organizations where you've trained people in mental health first aid. So again, it does nothing, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to. So yeah, theatre, this is a big thing as well. We do things to give the impression that we're making a difference. The fourth example is cognitive biases. So you may want to turn the brightness up on your screen if you can, but I'm going to show you some visual things that work better if the screen's a little bit brighter. So if you look at that, would you say those lines, are they parallel or are they wonky? Give you another example. Are those lines parallel or wonky? Of course, they look really wonky. Yeah, look wonky. But as section is called illusions, do you think they are wonky? No, they're not, but they really do look wonky, particularly this one. How would you, and you can type your answer or speak, how would you find out if they were parallel or they were wonky? How would you find out? What would you do? Yeah, ruler, yeah, measure, use a ruler. Yeah, measure the ends, exactly. Add a grid, perfect. Squint your eyes, yes, and you can do that. As well as squinting your eyes, what you can do, yes, Avi or Avi, you can focus on a particular side or section. You can also, if you can physically do it, if you look down the side of your screen, go really close to the screen and look down the side, you'll see they're actually parallel. If you can do it, you might not be able to do it. But if you can, you actually see they are parallel. Now, what you're demonstrating there perfectly is the idea of using multiple sources of evidence. And this is really important. You're looking at that, it definitely looks wonky. And you just told me of at least 2 or 3 different ways of actually verifying that. You're using other sources of information. It looks wonky, but what does the ruler tell me? It looks wonky, but what happens if I look at just at the end? It looks wonky, but what happens if I literally look at it from a different angle? It looks different. So I think optical illusions are quite useful for thinking about the fact we're very easily deceived, we're very easily fooled, and that's one of the things that makes us human, but there are strategies for kind of dealing with that. So here's another one, a classic Muller line. Of course, the gap between those lines is the same. Which elephant is biggest? Well, you know the answer. They're all the same size, but of course the one at the front looks the biggest. Again, you could just measure it. This is another one. Again, it depends on your brightness, but you could possibly see those yellow circles rotate a bit. Another kind of illusion. Some of you may recognize this. Any of you, it's a bit obscure. Do any of you recognize this diagram? Yes, exactly. It's change management K. It is not Lewin, really close, but it's based at Kotter. It's Kotter's model of organizational change. Now, I would say this is also a visual illusion. In that it makes sense. You create urgency, you do this, you do this, you do that, you do that. Oh, right, I get it. Oh, yeah. On first look, it makes sense. But actually, if you think about it a bit more, and the data and evidence behind it would suggest this is a kind of illusion. So very often in work, also presented with visual images that instantly make sense to us. It's a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something. It instantly makes sense, but actually it's fooling us because it looks a particular way. We quickly take it in. Yeah, Jackie says, yeah, Lou, yeah, exactly. Again, okay, so this one, are these lines, are they separate circles or are they going into each other? What do you think? Are they separate or going in? They look like they're going in, right? They're overlapping, but actually if you just follow one around, you'll see they're actually all separate circles, but it really looks like they're kind of overlapping. The visual thing, this is a really weird one. How many dots at any one time can you see? So stare at that and just type in how many. Thank you, Anne-Marie says separate, Jono, Claire. Yeah, you also probably because you followed it around. So Louise can see 2, Kate 6, Jono 12. Is that at any one time, Jono, or is it 2, 6, 2? Claire says the dots move. They do indeed. 12 to, yeah. So typically what happens with this, the bit you are looking at, the black dots are seen to appear. Some people can see 4, some people can see 2 sometimes, but then if you look at another part of it, they reappear. So again, if you didn't know this was illusion, you'd think these black dots are sort of switching on and off, but they're not. It's just static kind of image. Here's another one. So this is like a big Rubik's cube. I want you to look at the square in the middle of the top surface. So that square around the middle, and also the square in the surface that's facing us. If you look at that, you would say they are very, very different colors, right? So the one at the top looks brown. The one in the side facing us looks a bit kind of yellow. And the reason it does because of context. So if we start taking away some of the context, let's take away all the context, you can see they're exactly the same color. But if we take away bits of the context, they start to look a bit similar. Take away a bit more of the context, again, more similar. Take away even more, you can see they're the same color. So you may think, what's that got to do with evidence-based management? Well, one of the things is context can really shape the way we see things. If I show you a graph and I say, look, you know, the amount of absence in this organization has gone up, and I show you the graph, maybe it's the last 6 months. What I'm not showing you is the last 2 years. If you look at the last 2 years, yes, absence is indeed going up, but for the previous 6 months, it was dropping right down. So the context is, I'm only showing a little bit of the picture. So that's different from if I show you the whole thing. So again, context can be really important in this. Right, I'm going to show you some words in a triangle. I want you to tell me what it says. Are you ready? Type what you think it says in the chat. Interesting. Okay, that's quite nice. Okay, so it actually says Paris in the spring, which absolutely some of you got. Rihanna says that. A few people say it. Yep. Marie says that. Lisa says that. Okay, I showed you again. There it is, Paris in the spring. And again, the reason we don't see the other there is because we're pairs in the spring. Yeah. Thank you, Fiona. One of the reasons we don't see that is because we're very, very good at reading. We're so good at reading, we don't have to read every word. We can just skip over them. So if you've ever sat reading with, say, a 5-year-old, you know, or 4-year-old, look at every single letter of every single word, they would have spotted the 2 the's. But the reason we don't, because we're so good at reading, we just skip over words. Otherwise, it would be very hard for us to read anything at any kind of speed. I'm going to show you something else, and I want to ask you to not read. So try to not read what I'm going to show you. You ready? Don't read this. Keep your eyes open, but don't read it. Did you manage to not read it? No. We're so good and so fast at reading that we can't help reading. And this is you may have seen this kind of thing before. This is a, can you read this? Yes. And at first you think, I'm not going to be able to read that. You've probably seen this meme before, but if you keep reading it, this message serves to prove how our minds can do amazing things, etc., etc. And again, it's because we're so good at reading. It doesn't matter if it's full of mistakes. We're so used to looking at words and the shape of words, we can kind of correct the blanks, fill in the blanks, and so on. And at the bottom, it says, be proud. Only certain people can read this. I don't think that's true. So I'm sorry if you felt special, but I don't think it does mean you're special necessarily. So yeah, but it's another example of how quickly we process information. And that's literally true if you're sitting in work making a decision, someone gives you a piece of information, it's so fast that sometimes we're not even aware of what's going to happen. So we should never just believe what we see or hear. Images, words, numbers, and graphs can deceive us. We always need to look at multiple sources of data to check out our initial perception in order to triangulate. In the case of visual illusions, literally look at it from another angle, or as you said, use a ruler. In the case of cognitive illusions, which I'm going to talk about now, you need to slow down or think about it in another way. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to answer it. I'd like you to type your answer, whatever you think it is, after about 10 seconds. If you've seen this question before, so if you already know the answer, please don't answer it. So if you already know the answer, the correct answer, because you've seen it before, don't answer it. But for everyone else, I'd like you to give what you think is the answer, okay? So this is the question. I'll give you 10 seconds to answer it, starting around now. So it's a bat and a ball, cost £1 and 10 pence. The bat cost £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Okay, could you now type your answer? Great. Toby says 5, Louise says 10, Jono or Jenna says 10, Jane says 10, Anne-Marie 10, Fiona says £1 10. Any more answers? And bear in mind, it's okay to get it wrong. And you know this is a trick question, so the first time, yeah, when I saw this, I got it wrong. Most people get it wrong. Marion says 10. Okay. So most people said 10. I think some people, Jane says 90, a couple of people said £1 10. So do you guess who has got the correct answer? Can you guess? Ah, Jane. No, Jane hasn't got the correct answer. Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, Toby has the correct answer. Toby, do you want to say how you got to the right answer? You kind of said it in the chat. Tell us how you got to the right answer, which is 5. Oh, Toby, do you mean you already knew the answer? Yes, exactly, Jackie. Cheating. Oh, Toby, I said to not answer. Okay, all right. So the only person who got it right was the person who already knew the answer. Now, the reason it's 5, there's 2 ways of getting this right. Jane says the bat is £1 more. So if the ball is 10, the bat will be £1 10 plus. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Jane, what you're doing there is one of the ways of getting it right. If you think your answer is 10, what you're doing is checking it out. If the answer is 10, which is the answer most of you want to give, apart from Toby, who already knew the answer you want to give is 10, right? So you check it out. You say, okay, so if it's 10 and the bat cost £1 more than the ball, the bat will be, as you say, Jane, £1 10. So together, there'll be £1 20. So it cannot be 10. So that doesn't tell you it's 5, but you can kind of work backwards. There were 10's obviously too much. Another way of doing it, which I don't know how to do, is through equations. If you studied algebra or maths problems in a particular way, you will look at that puzzle and you'll say, well, if it's £1 and 10, it's 5 pence goes to the bat and 5 pence go to the ball, so the ball costs 5 pence. Or you'll say x plus y minus. I don't think like that. But some people do. They've been trained to do that and they get it really, really fast. What's also interesting about this problem is if you present it to people and you don't tell them it's a trick question, like you, about 80 or 90% of people give the wrong answer. But if you don't tell them it's a trick question, they're often very confident about their answer. They're very certain. And again, if there's one lesson you take from this, yes, of course, we're easily fooled, but we also may be very confident. So even if you're very confident, you're at work, you're looking at some data, someone's given you a report, you're looking at the results of something, you may be very confident, but just think, wait a minute, can I check that? Is there another way? Can I check it's right, like Jane did? Or like you say, can I check those lines really are wonky? So again, don't just believe what you see, what you hear, or what seems correct. You might be right, but there's not much relationship between how confident people are about stuff and how right they are about stuff. So they're often not particularly related. That's quite important. And of course, there's lots of other biases: confirmation bias, mere exposure effect, the hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is where you say, I knew that would happen. And of course you didn't, because if you knew it was going to happen, you would have done something about it. Framing effect, lots of different ones. And I think the most important bias is a metacognitive bias, which is the belief that we are all immune from such biases. A lot of us think if we just think hard enough, just in general, we're not biased, but we're full of biases, and that's fine. And some of those biases are good and they help us do things. Some of them are not good. But when it comes to evidence-based practice, it's important to try and at least deal with, as much as we can, some of those biases. This is about another sort of checklist I did, which I mentioned already, was if you're working together with people and trying to go through even a simple evidence-based practice process, you have to think about these kinds of questions to try and understand if you're biased. So were you confident you already knew what the problem was before you started collecting evidence? And if you were pretty confident, you need to think about, well, okay, maybe that was a bias. Were you confident you already knew which solution was likely to work before you started collecting evidence? Again, it could be a bias. While gathering evidence, were you at any point aware that you were trying to find evidence that supported your views? And again, we all do this. For a particular view, we look for the data that will support it. While gathering evidence, were you at any point trying to ignore evidence which contradicted what you already held? Do you feel you had a vested interest in finding a particular answer to the question? Did you hope that the evidence would provide the answer you wanted to find? And a great example of this is when people give results, they often say things like, oh, I'm really disappointed in this finding. Why? Why are you disappointed? You know, it's good to find out if that worked or not. Why are you disappointed? Could be a source of bias. And also, were you prepared to change your mind about the problem depending on the evidence? And if you score that, it gives you a sense of potentially how biased you're likely to be. So the final barrier, and I'll just conclude, is about incentives. What are you incentivized to do in your job? If you go back into work or do other work tasks this afternoon, what are you really incentivized to do? Are you being incentivized to do evidence-based practice? Most of us probably are not. How do you and your colleagues advance in your career and gain power? Is it through doing and supporting evidence-based practice? Sometimes, but probably not. And instead of evidence-based practice, we're often incentivized in many jobs to do stuff, a bit like management theatre, and to do it quickly and to please our bosses. So very often what we're pushed towards is not evidence-based practice and pushed away from doing evidence-based practice. And this is a really important barrier. As an individual, there's not much we can do about that, but collectively, I think there is something we can do about that. So just a quick chat blast. In your experience, and you started to talk about this a bit, how do power, politics, and incentives get in the way of evidence-based working? So again, put your thoughts in the chat and I'll tell you when 60 seconds is up and you can add them. So that's the question. How do power and politics get in the way of evidence-based working? This could be big P, small p, any kind of politics and any kind of power, really. Yeah, Zoe, pressure to deliver a solution that fits with pre-identified priorities. Yeah. So you're encouraged to think of a solution to this problem, but it has to be one of these things. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Vicky, the people in power want them to give you the answer they want. People who talk or don't listen are the people who tend to be better as a manager. Yeah, exactly. Again, it's an institutional thing. It's very rare that I come across it happens, but really senior people who are very evidence-based, because typically people don't get to those positions by being very evidence-based. There are a few, and that tells you more about our organizations and institutions than those as people. I think as we tend to reward people, perhaps don't listen and talk a lot. Pam, hippo decision-making. I'm going to mention that later. Yes, highest paid person's opinions, as Pam says. Marie, budget pressure, invest in new system, fear resistance, undo was implement. Yep, that absolutely gets in the way. Louise says he used to get into bad habits and follow the new thing, which is very much just a big and small. It is absolutely. So politically, you see governments who also tend to follow fads and fashions. That trickles down to all kind of public sector stuff. Kev says priority of what's seen short term, yeah, quick wins, visible wins, all that kind of stuff. People's strong opinions, Kate says, they don't want to hear about, yes, they don't want to hear about evidence that contradicts. They've got a very strong view. Jackie says pushing direction, a solutionary focus, yeah, bias, very little influence. Jonah says people need to be seen to be doing things, adding more stuff. Yeah, really good point. No time to dismantle processes and rebuild. Again, the whole point of evidence-based practice in many fields is really important to stop doing stuff. And typically we don't, that's quite hard to do for political reasons. And we just tend to do more and more and build on stuff that already is not very kind of effective. So when we introduce things, I always think we should do at the beginning, we should say, we're going to do this new thing, but you know what? If in 2 years' time it's not achieving these goals, we are going to stop doing it. So every new thing with it is and this is when we're going to stop doing it. But we don't tend to do that. We're all very excited about the new thing. Rihanna says they already have an answer. Yep. Tell people I want to hear. To challenge people need for a certain amount of care. Yep. Local MP. Budgets culture, says Bryony. The big solution might be seen as challenging. Caught with the boat. Bright, shiny things. Yes, short. Exactly. Great. Great answer. I think politics really can play a major kind of issue in this. Okay, so how can we start to apply this in our own work? Just to recap, some of this seems very technical, and it can be, but it's not really. In another way, it's basically to help us identify what's most important for our clients and doing things that are most likely to help. This is done through those 3 principles: multiple sources, structured approach, using the most trustworthy. I've shown you a model, but it really doesn't matter as long as you say when we're dealing with something, are we doing these 3 things? Multiple sources, structured approach, focusing on the most trustworthy, and identifying the issue before we're trying to identify the solution, which is part of that kind of structure. So that's kind of what it is. People often ask these questions, do we need to apply it to everything we do? No, we do not. Because of all the things you just mentioned, sometimes there's no opportunity, there's no chance, there's no time, there's politics. We just have to do sort of what we're required to do. Is it necessary to follow every single part of the process? No. Skip steps, that's fine. Is it necessary to gather evidence for all 4 sources? No. Multiple sources. So 2 is better than 1, 3 is probably better than 2, 4 is probably better than 3. But the key is multiple sources. I just mentioned it doesn't get in the way of experiments and innovation. They are based on evidence-based practice. Evaluation of interventions. I think, again, you can only evaluate effectively if you go through this process, because by going through this process, you understand what it is you're trying to change and why the thing you're suggesting might change it, why that might work. So you've already got some criteria for evaluation before you've even started the intervention. Should you integrate it? Absolutely. There should not be, where it's a big kind of important thing, you should do it before you even start to plan the work and build it into the work. And on the left-hand side, I think we should use evidence-based practice when it's important, when it's going to take a lot of resources, if there's a lot of risk, which I guess applies to a lot of your work, where there's accountability and where there's ethical issues. If you're ticking a lot of those boxes, that probably tells you it's a situation of using EVHR. If it's just compliance, you just have to do it. If there's no time to do it and people have already started the solution, then again, there's no point in trying evidence-based HR. So use it selectively when it makes sense to do it. So not going to do this now because of time, but the idea will be to think about how you can do more evidence-based work in your own role or team, and particularly are there issues coming up which you could take this approach to. So you could say, this thing is on the horizon, this is coming, let's just try to do a bit of evidence-based working for this particular thing. So it's important to think ahead rather than do it for things where you've already made decisions. So just to conclude, these are the benefits, I think, of evidence-based HR. It says here, the business of HR applies to all, but it helps us, the ability of us to focus on helping our clients, a better focus on what we're trying to do, helps us with risk, helps us to prioritize. We haven't got time to do everything. How can we prioritize? It increases our value, it reduces waste, It enhances ethical standards because we know more about what the issues are and what the effects of interventions might be, and it helps the development of the function, I think. You can't do it on your own. You need a team. You can't always do it. Focus on when you can. Remember the benefits. Take it slowly. Don't beat yourself up. And always remember it's about making better informed, not perfect decisions. Now, back to HIPPO. People often say, what's the alternative to evidence-based working? Well, there's a number of alternatives. One is eminence-based, in this case HR, but working. HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. Vehemence-based HR, the activities driven by people express things with the greatest volume. Eloquence-based HR, it's whatever smooth talkers tell you. Obedience-based, where you just do what you're told. Resemblance-based, copying what other people are doing. Defense-based, doing the safest thing. Indolence-based, doing the thing that's going to require least effort. Haste-based, doing the thing that's going to be fastest. Indulgence-based, choosing to do whatever you think you like to enjoy doing. Or reverence-based, looking around for whatever you think is the coolest or most amazing or truly awesome thing, and then doing that. So thank you very much. I've come up to the end of time. There probably isn't time for questions. I'm happy to take them if there is. If not, please feel free to contact me. I think my email details, yeah, you can email me. It's on the slides, but thank you so much for your participation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rob. It was a great session and really insightful. Thank you for everyone attending this morning, and also thank you for colleagues behind the scenes who are making all this happen. Just a few final words. I think what Rob's shown is it is vital that we at least have some level of evidence-based approach within the decision making that we have, and that by doing so we can avoid some of those fads and those consequences of wasted time, resource, and cost. By doing so, again, this is an area I'm really passionate about, and I think, Rob, I'm usually that lone wolf or that agitator who's trying to make people think of this. So it is really nice to have this knowledge shared with colleagues this morning. Just a few final points. Materials, slides will be made available in the coming days, as will the recording. If you could take some time to please complete the evaluation, that will be greatly appreciated. Again, it just gives us some feedback and again an evidence base that we can look at in order to make sure the sessions that we're putting on are as good as they can be. Our next session is on the 11th of December, where it is very much making care closer to home a reality. So again, it will be great if you can join us on the 11th of December for that session. So again, thank you, Rob, and for all who've participated and supported today. Have a lovely rest of your day and a fantastic weekend. Thank you.